In the last episode, we left a world at its absolute peak, a glorious system, ticking along like a Swiss watch. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Egyptians, giants convinced of their own invincibility, living in breathtaking wealth. But a grain of sand was about to fall into those gears. A shadow had appeared on the horizon. A relentless people, unknown, who came from nowhere. They came from the sea. The temple walls of Egypt call them the Sea Peoples, and this is one of history's greatest, most persistent mysteries. Why? Because we know who sacked Rome, the Goths, the Vandals. We know where they came from, their language, their goals. But the Sea Peoples, they seem to have emerged from nothingness, destroyed civilization, and then vanished back into it. They are history's ghosts, and they were a storm that didn't just topple one civilization, they toppled all of them. So, who were they? Welcome to the Shard of History. Almost everything we know about the Sea Peoples comes, ironically, from a single source: their victims. More specifically, Egypt, because Egypt was the only great power to confront them and survive. Our evidence is carved into the walls of Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu. And this brings us to a critical interpretation. History is written by the victors. Ramesses' goal was not to give us an objective history lesson. It was to broadcast his own propaganda. He was the pharaoh of order who had conquered chaos. So we have to see this evidence through his filter. So what does Ramesses' filter show us? These carvings. They don't depict a war. They depict a chaos, a massive fleet coming from the sea. But this fleet isn't just warriors. The carvings also show women and children riding in ox carts. This is the critical detail that changes our entire analysis. This was not a military invasion. This was a migration, with a navy. It's as if they had no homes left to return to. These people weren't coming to raid and go home. They were coming to stay, and to stay, they were prepared to destroy everything in their path. Ramesses had their names carved on the walls, too. The Peliset, the Checker, the Sheridan, the Denyen, the Weshesh. These names don't point to a single nation. They point to a confederation, a club of losers. Ramesses boasts in his texts of how he fought them and annihilated them in the Nile Delta. Egypt was saved, but by the time they reached Egypt, these Sea Peoples had already set the rest of civilization on fire. That mighty Hittite empire to the north, it didn't just weaken, it vanished. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned and never resettled. This was the death of an empire. The rich trading port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. From its ashes, the king's last desperate letter was found. "The enemy ships are here. They are burning my cities. Help me." That help never came. The Mycenaean palaces in the Aegean, the glorious fortresses of those mafia dons, all of them burned. The Golden Age ended, seemingly overnight. This wasn't the collapse of an empire. This was the collapse of the entire system, and they were the ones who pulled the trigger. So, what started this wave of slaughter and migration? Who were these people, and where did they come from? We don't know the answer, but we have three powerful theories, and these theories, in fact, don't really contradict each other. Theory 1. The domino effect. The Mycenaean theory. This is the most popular and the most logical theory. According to this, it all started with climate change. A sudden intense drought beginning around 1200 BCE hit Greece and the Aegean. Remember, the Mycenaean world was run like mafia families competing palace states. When resources, namely grain, disappeared, what did they do? They turned on each other. The system collapsed. The first gear of that Swiss watch had just broken. Starving Mycenaean warriors, merchants, and farmers put their families on boats. Their first target, their rich neighbors in Anatolia, the Hittites. As they advanced, the remnants of the people they conquered joined them. They grew like an avalanche. The Peliset tribe is widely believed to be the Philistines we read about later in the Bible. So, in this theory, the Sea Peoples were the collapsed Mycenaean civilization. Theory 2. Barbarians at the gate, the pirate theory. This theory suggests the Sea Peoples weren't new. They had always been there. Outside the bright, globalized world we described in Episode 1, there were tribes the system considered barbarians. Sardinians, the Shurden, perhaps Sicilians. What's interesting is, these groups had been working for Egypt and the Hittites for centuries, as mercenaries or as pirates. They weren't part of the system. They were parasites feeding off the system. And then the system got weak. Maybe an earthquake storm. Maybe a famine slowed that Swiss watch. The pirates and mercenaries, the outsiders, sensed the weakness. They turned on their masters and united to plunder everything. In this theory, the Sea Peoples weren't a civil war within the system. They were an opportunistic attack from outside. This is a story of how the outcasts created by the system can turn into a monster when that system falters. Theory 3. The Civil War, the Systemic Collapse Theory. This is the darkest and, in my interpretation, the most terrifying theory. What if the Sea Peoples didn't come from the outside? What if they were already inside? Remember, the palace economy ran this world. Everything was owned by the king. 99% of the population worked to feed the top 1% elite. So, what happens when the grain shipments stop arriving to feed that 99%? In this theory, the Sea Peoples were not an ethnic group. They were a social class. They were the starving peasants, the slaves, and the lower-class soldiers who rose up against the Hittite and Mycenaean palaces. When the palace economy failed them, they burned the palaces. The Sea Peoples' invasion was, in fact, a revolutionary civil war. This wasn't a barbarian invasion. It was a French Revolution, just with bronze swords instead of guillotines. So, which theory is correct? The answer is probably all of them. The Sea Peoples were not a single group. They were a symptom of a collapsing world. It's like a patient with a high fever. The fever isn't the disease. It's the symptom of the infection inside the body. The Sea Peoples were the fever. The actual infection was the system itself. Climate change, an over-centralized economy and resentment of the elites, Mycenaean refugees fleeing starvation, Italian pirates sensing opportunity, and Hittite peasants rising up against their masters. They all merged in the same chaos to form the most destructive force history had ever seen. They didn't start the collapse. They were the collapse. The fragile gears of that Swiss watch system, already slowed by famine and earthquakes, had ground to a halt. The Sea Peoples were simply the sledgehammer that delivered the final fatal blow to a machine that was already breaking. Subscribe to the Shard of History. Now that we know the invaders, in the next episode, we look at the first victim to be completely pulverized by that sledgehammer. Why was the Hittite Empire completely erased from the map?